An American liaison officer sat under a whining ceiling fan and stared at a map that was already soft at the folds. The paper was blotched with humidity, pencil marks, coffee rings, an entire war reduced to grid squares and thin blue rivers. 6 days ago, an Australian SAS patrol had stepped off a helicopter skid and walked into the green like it was a doorway. Since then, nothing. No scheduled check-in, no clipped voice over the net, no all okay or stand by. Not even the accidental burst of static you sometimes heard when someone bumped a handset. Silence. The liaison officer watched the minute hand on his watch crawl forward and felt something cold collect between his shoulder blades. His own teams, American teams, checked in every hour like it was religion. They called in air support at first contact and sometimes before contact. They demanded extraction at the first complication that smelled like bad luck. That wasn't cowardice. That was doctrine. That was a system built on certainty, connectivity, and the promise that if you got into trouble, an entire sky full of help could come looking for you. But these Australians, they vanished for a week and came back with intelligence that flipped entire operations upside down, quietly, almost casually, like they'd been out hunting. He picked up the phone and called the Australian base. "Your men have been silent for 6 days," he said. He tried to make it sound professional. He failed. Anxiety leaked through anyway. "Are you planning a search and rescue?" There was a pause. Not the pause of confusion, the pause of someone trying not to laugh. Then a voice on the other end actually did laugh. Soft, amused, almost kind. "Planning?" the Australian said. "Mate, they're working." The liaison officer gripped the receiver harder. "Working? If something had gone wrong," the voice continued, "you'd already know." Click, the line went dead. The liaison officer stayed there for a moment, listening to the emptiness as if the dial tone might turn into an explanation. It didn't. He hung up slowly and looked back at the map. Somewhere inside those squares, 5 men were moving, breathing, watching, and refusing to exist on the airwaves. To understand how Australians learned to dissolve into jungle so completely that even their allies lost track of them, you have to go back. Not to Vietnam, not to the rubber plantations and rice paddies, but to the beginning of their logic. To the training grounds where recruits were taught the rule that sounded insane to American ears. If you transmit, you're already dead. American doctrine treated communication like oxygen. The Australians treated it like smoke. And that difference wasn't a quirk. It was a doctrine, forged in selection and hammered into muscle memory until silence became instinct. It begins where Australian SAS stories tend to begin, near the western coast, where the land turns harsh and honest, and the bush doesn't care about your rank. Campbell Barracks sat outside Perth, squat and unglamorous, surrounded by scrubland that looked empty until you tried to cross it. In the 1960s, that unassuming installation housed the Special Air Service Regiment, Australia's answer to the British SAS, trained for problems conventional forces couldn't solve. Men arrived at selection with the confident posture of athletes and infantry NCOs. They thought they knew hardship. They thought they'd already proven themselves. Most discovered within days that they'd only met the idea of hardship, not the real thing. The marches came first. Long kilometers across Australian terrain with full combat loads. No set pace, no cheerful cadence calling you onward, no scheduled breaks, just movement until the instructors decided movement should stop. The sun did its part. The heat pressed down like a hand. The dust found every seam in your clothing. Sweat turned to salt on your skin. Boots chewed at feet until blisters rose and burst and rose again. Bodies failed in predictable ways. Heat exhaustion, cramping, swelling joints, the sudden hollow stare of a man who has burned through whatever he thought his limits were. Candidates dropped, sometimes with a dramatic collapse, sometimes quietly, stepping off the line because their body had reached a point where it simply refused to cooperate. The instructors didn't rush in with comforting words. They watched, because the marches weren't really about distance. They were about what emerged when comfort was stripped away. Stress reveals character. Exhaustion erases pretense. Hunger doesn't just weaken the body, it exposes the mind. Day after day, the punishment continued. There was no satisfying moment where you passed something and got to rest. One test ended and another began as if the course itself hated the idea of recovery. Sleep became a rumor. Food was rationed to the point of constant grinding hunger. Enough to keep you alive, not enough to make you human again. The body broke down in stages. First the feet, then the joints, then the will. Instructors watched for patterns. Some men quit openly. Those were the honest failures. Others didn't quit. They just started making mistakes. Small errors, navigation slips, gear left unsecured, decisions that made no sense. The mistakes piled up until the man was no longer functional. Those were quiet failures. Others tried to hide their deterioration, smiling through pain, pretending capability they no longer possessed. Those were dangerous failures because a man who lies to himself will eventually lie to the patrol. All of these told the instructors something useful, but there was one failure mode that went deeper than physical weakness or poor judgment. Something the Australians considered fatal in a way you couldn't fix with training. Some candidates couldn't function without feedback. They needed to know how they were doing. They needed encouragement encouragement. They needed the psychological comfort of being watched, evaluated, and reassured that their suffering had meaning. They needed an audience, and in the jungle, there is no audience. There is only you, the terrain, and whatever is hunting you. This was a quiet but crucial difference from American Special Forces selection, which, however brutal, took place inside a system of constant oversight. Instructors were always nearby, medics were always somewhere in reach, evaluation was continuous, candidates knew they were being assessed, knew their pain was controlled and purposeful. Australian selection included phases of genuine isolation. Candidates were given minimal equipment and dropped into the outback with instructions to reach a distant point, a grid reference, a time window, a simple order, no instructor shadowing them, no safety net that felt real, no voice of authority just beyond the ridgeline. They were alone in terrain that could actually harm them. It wasn't theater. Men got lost. Men made navigation errors that added days. Men encountered conditions they weren't prepared for and had to improvise solutions with no guidance, no reassurance, no comforting certainty that someone was monitoring their struggle. And in that reality, a particular weakness appeared like a stain. Some men couldn't function without the belief that rescue was possible at any moment. They needed connection to authority. They needed the psychological rope of command. They failed selection not because they lacked strength. Some were exceptional athletes who had breezed through the physical tests, but because they lacked the independence the SAS demanded. The men who passed had proven something harder to build than muscle. They could operate in genuine isolation without falling apart. They could make decisions without guidance. They could function when no one was coming to help. That ability would matter in Vietnam. But first, it had to be shaped into doctrine, into habits that could be taught, repeated, and relied upon. After selection, training focused relentlessly on one principle: self-sufficiency. Australian SAS patrols were expected to operate for extended periods without resupply, without reinforcement, without the support structures American forces considered essential. Navigation training emphasized terrain association over instruments. The men memorized maps until they could see the ground in their minds: ridge lines, drainage patterns, vegetation shifts that signaled changes in elevation and soil. They learned to read the land like a book written in shadows. The reasoning was brutally practical. Compass navigation required attention and concentration. In combat, attention was a currency you spent quickly. When stress hit, when a patrol moved rapidly under threat, bearings were misread, pace counts forgotten, calculations ruined by adrenaline. But recognition held. A patrol that truly knew the ground could confirm its position in seconds just by looking around. They could move under pressure without stopping to shoot azimuths and whisper numbers. And if you always knew where you were, you didn't need to transmit constant position updates. Movement training emphasized patience in a way Americans often found almost incomprehensible. Australian patrols moved slowly through jungle, far slower than American recommended rates of advance. To an outsider, it looked inefficient, absurd even, until you understood the purpose. Slow movement enabled noise discipline that speed made impossible. Every step could be evaluated before weight was committed. Every dry leaf, loose branch, unstable rock, identified and avoided. A patrol moving at a crawl left no acoustic signature. A patrol moving at American speed sounded like a small storm. The slow pace also enabled continuous observation. Fast-moving patrols focused on the destination. Their attention was consumed by the mechanics of movement and progress. Slow-moving patrols had time to see. They noticed disturbed earth, a snapped vine that didn't match the wind, a trail too subtle for aerial reconnaissance, a pattern of cigarette butts buried under leaves, the faintest pressure mark where someone had squatted, waited, watched. The intelligence value of this patience was enormous. Australian patrols found camps hidden for months. They located trails that aircraft had flown over 100 times without seeing. They gathered information that speed would have destroyed. But the most distinctive element, the line that divided their doctrine from American methods like a knife, was the radio rule. Australian instructors taught that transmission was inherently dangerous. Every signal created electromagnetic emission, and emissions could be detected. Direction-finding equipment didn't need to decode a message to make it useful. It only needed to know someone was talking. In Vietnam, the enemy invested heavily in interception and direction finding. They monitored Allied frequencies. They listened for activity. They used transmissions to build a picture of where patrols were operating. The implications were simple and vicious. A patrol that transmitted regularly gave the enemy a heartbeat to follow. American patrols often checked in hourly. That meant hourly confirmation that a patrol was in a sector. Not an exact pinpoint. Direction finding wasn't magic, but a narrowing box. Enough to concentrate forces, enough to set ambushes, enough to shape the jungle around the patrol like a trap being slowly tightened. The enemy couldn't read the encrypted words. They didn't have to. The transmission itself was the intelligence. Australian patrols maintained radio silence for days, sometimes longer. They completed entire missions without speaking a single syllable into the handset. The radio was carried for emergencies, true emergencies, when the cost of transmission was outweighed by immediate survival. But routine communication simply did not occur, and that doctrine required every everything else. They navigated without updates because they weren't sending updates. They handled problems without calling for help because help wasn't part of the plan. They functioned in real isolation because that was the environment their training had prepared them for. American training produced men who could survive with support. Australian training produced men who could succeed without it. When the first Australian SAS squadron deployed to Vietnam in 1966, they arrived with that entire philosophy packed into their habits. They established themselves at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy province. Jungle, rubber plantations, rice paddies. Not the most heavily contested province, but full of enemy presence. Local Viet Cong units and North Vietnamese regulars filtering through. American liaison officers assigned to coordinate expected the usual machinery of combined operations. Communication schedules, fire support coordination, extraction timing, constant updates. What they encountered instead felt like professional culture shock. Australian patrols didn't submit communication schedules because they didn't intend to communicate. They didn't request fire support packages because they didn't intend to call fire. They didn't coordinate extraction down to the minute because extraction would happen when the patrol decided it should happen, not when a headquarters clock demanded it. The first Americans to work with them found it genuinely disturbing. Silence meant disaster in American instincts. The Australians offered minimal explanation, less reassurance. Patrol departs on schedule. Patrol returns within the window. What happens in between? That was the patrol's business. Headquarters would not be updated. Questions would not be answered. The silence was intentional. The early weeks produced friction that edged toward real conflict. Americans demanded information the Australians refused to provide. They asked for position updates that never came. They expressed concern about patrol safety that Australian officers dismissed with impatience so casual it felt insulting. Then results began accumulating, and numbers have a way of ending arguments. American long-range reconnaissance patrols in similar terrain reported contact rates around 70%. Most missions ran into the enemy. They fought running engagements. They called for fire. They extracted under pressure with disturbing regularity. The operations were dramatic, violent, and expensive. Australian patrols reported contact rates below 30%. They found enemy positions but were rarely detected. They gathered intelligence without engaging. They stayed out 7 to 14 days without a single hostile encounter. The disparity demanded explanation. American commanders wanted to know what the Australians were doing differently. The Australian answer was simple. We're not being detected because we're not transmitting. The enemy had learned to monitor Allied traffic for activity. Any transmission signaled presence. Regular transmissions allowed rough tracking. Requests for support revealed contact. Updates created patterns. American patrols broadcast signatures continuously. Australian patrols did not. They moved through the jungle without electromagnetic footprint. And because the enemy had no warning, no estimate, no pattern, Australian patrols became operationally invisible in a way supported forces could not achieve. But the advantage of radio silence went deeper than detection avoidance. It shaped how the Australians thought. American patrols operated with a quiet assumption: support was available. If contact went bad, helicopters could extract them. If the enemy was strong, artillery and air could smash the jungle into compliance. That assumption encouraged aggression. Engagement was less frightening when consequences could be mitigated by external power. Australian patrols didn't have that comfort. Contact meant fighting with what you carried. If the enemy was overwhelming, you didn't hold until support arrives. You vanished. That reality produced different choices. They avoided fights Americans might seek. They declined engagements American commanders might consider mandatory. They prioritized intelligence and survival over body counts. Some Americans interpreted this as timidity. The statistics suggested something else. Australian kill ratios, enemy losses compared to friendly casualties, often exceeded American figures for comparable reconnaissance operations. They weren't less lethal. They were more selective. They fought when conditions heavily favored them, from positions of advantage, against enemies who didn't know they were there. Their engagements were brief, violent, and almost universally successful. American patrols more often stumbled into contact, fought on the enemy's terms, and paid for it. This wasn't theory. It played out patrol after patrol, and one mission in particular became a reference point, a demonstration of what silence could buy. A 5-man team inserted into an area where intelligence suggested significant enemy activity. Standard reconnaissance: locate positions, assess strength, return with something planners could use. Moving with the patience drilled into their bones, they noticed signs. Traffic that didn't match villagers, movement patterns too disciplined to be random. They followed those signs like a scent. Eventually they saw it: a facility that didn't belong in the jungle by accident, fortified positions, personnel numbers that felt too big, antennas, a rhythm of movement that suggested staff work, men arriving, men leaving, guards rotating with professional timing. It looked like a headquarters, something at a level that could shape operations far beyond the trees around it. An American patrol finding that would transmit within minutes. Opportunity like that seemed to justify anything. Call it in, bring the sky down, destroy it before it disappeared. The Australian patrol leader stared at it through leaves and thought in a different language. If we transmit, we announce ourselves. Even a short burst could be detected. If the enemy realized their headquarters was compromised, the facility would scatter. Personnel would melt away into tunnels and villages. Coordinates called in quickly would land on an emptiness that smelled like missed chances. So he ordered continued observation. For days, the team held positions within range, motionless for hours, eating cold rations so no cooking smell drifted, managing body functions without leaving their hides, enduring insects that crawled into seams, humidity that never allowed skin to dry, cramps that came from holding still too long. They mapped defensive positions, tracked personnel flows, identified communications nodes, watched patterns that would have been invisible to a patrol that only wanted a quick coordinate and a fast strike. When they finally withdrew, they did it without calling a helicopter, moving out on foot so they didn't announce the patrol's existence with rotor noise and dust. They returned with intelligence that wasn't just a target, it was understanding, and the strikes that followed were devastating precisely because the enemy had no warning. They hadn't detected the patrol. They didn't know they'd been studied. They hadn't evacuated. They hadn't reinforced. They hadn't prepared. Patient observation multiplied the value of that discovery. American officers reviewing the mission couldn't deny the results. Some argued hard for adopting similar methods. Others pointed to what felt like unacceptable risks. What if the patrol had been detected during those days? What if casualties happened and they couldn't call for help? What if the patrol never returned and the intelligence died with them? What if the enemy moved anyway and the whole effort became obsolete? The debate exposed something deeper than tactics. It exposed philosophy. American doctrine emphasized command control. A commander was responsible for his forces, and responsibility demanded information. Information demanded communication. Silence felt like negligence. How can you command what you cannot contact? Australian doctrine answered with trust. You select men capable of independence. You train them until their skills are beyond doubt. You give them clear objectives, and then you let them work. Headquarters interference isn't expected or desired. The commander's job is to prepare the force properly and employ it wisely, not to monitor every footstep. These differences produced different capabilities. America had massive support: artillery, airstrikes, rapid extraction, reinforcement, but it was tethered to systems that compromised concealment. Australia accepted fewer immediate support options, but gained invisibility. Neither approach was universally superior. Firepower mattered in some contexts, silence mattered in others. In jungle reconnaissance, where the goal was intelligence, not annihilation, concealment was often more valuable than firepower. A patrol that stayed undetected could gather more and better information than one compromised into fighting for its life. The numbers again supported that. So why didn't the Americans simply adopt the Australian method? Because doctrine isn't only logic, it's culture. You can teach techniques quickly. You can't rewire institutional instincts overnight. Australian radio silence worked because Australian commanders accepted uncertainty. They sent patrols out and waited. They didn't demand hourly updates. They tolerated not knowing. American commanders, shaped by a different professional identity, found that psychologically intolerable. The impulse to connect, to verify, to check, to control ran deep, and those cultural roots went deeper than uniforms. Australia was a nation shaped by isolation. The interior was harsh and far from help. Self-reliance wasn't a slogan, it was survival. The bush and outback produced a kind of comfort with being alone. American mythology celebrated networks, communities built, systems connected, support brought to where it was needed. Coordination was strength, communication was capability. The network itself felt like the great American advantage. Turning it off felt like abandoning what made you strong. So the lesson remained: understood, admired, even partially borrowed, but not fully absorbed. The war ended with Australian methods validated but not institutionalized across American forces. The evidence sat in reports. The logic sat in after-action reviews. The cultural barrier sat in hearts and habits. Years later, new conflicts forced new questions. In 1980, the Iranian hostage rescue attempt collapsed under coordination problems and equipment failures. Operations in Grenada exposed forces that struggled when planned support didn't materialize. Pain has a way of reopening old files. Had American special operations become too dependent on systems that might fail? Had constant connectivity created a vulnerability enemies could exploit? The Australian example from Vietnam offered uncomfortable answers. Yes, sometimes the network is strength, but sometimes the network is also a beacon, and sometimes the quietest patrol is the most lethal one, because no one knows it exists until it's gone. Over time, some of those lessons seeped into American training. Selection began to emphasize psychological resilience alongside physical capability. Training incorporated periods of reduced communication. Doctrine acknowledged that in some environments, transmission might be impossible, or worse, suicidal. Still, the American commitment to coordination and control never vanished. Technology marched the opposite direction, making communication easier than ever. Satellites, digital networks, constant data. But easier communication doesn't mean safer communication. Modern warfare includes environments where connectivity is a liability. Electronic warfare can disrupt or deceive. Cyber operations can compromise systems invisibly. Remote regions swallow signals. Urban terrain can be monitored so thoroughly that a single transmission is a flare. In those places, the force that can operate without talking holds an advantage. The Australian SAS in Vietnam demonstrated how to build that capability. Through selection that identified men comfortable with isolation, through training that demanded self-sufficiency, through doctrine that treated silence as strength. Those men, those quiet ghosts of Phuoc Tui, have mostly passed from active service and many from life itself. Their experiences survived survive in reports and memories and occasional oral histories that capture what radio silence actually meant. Small teams alone in hostile jungle for days, sometimes weeks, trusting nothing but their training and each other.